Hello, everyone. Welcome to GRIIT Guest Expert Series. I'm excited to bring on today our guest, Victor Lee, whom I met via a professional networking group and have enjoyed building a collaborative partnership. Victor Lee is the co-host of the networking podcast, Things I Didn't Learn at Harvard. He is the creator of the Impresario Approach to Cognitive Networking and president of Stonehorse Enterprises. He is joining us today to discuss networking in the global marketplace. Hi, Victor. Thank you for joining us.
Hi, Sarita. Thank you for inviting me. It's great to be here and great to see you as always.
Absolutely, absolutely. So, as I mentioned, you're going to share with us, since you have your podcast that focuses on networking, you invite a lot of different people in the business community to talk about networking and what it means for their business growth. And as I mentioned, you and I met through a professional networking group. And so
Yes.
you have this framework that I would like for you to share with our audience to tell us more about your impresario approach to cognitive networking.
Well, thank you, Sarita, and thanks for asking. And by the way, I just want to start by thanking you for having been a guest on our podcast because
Absolutely.
I thought you brought a lot to it, and obviously you're a great networker yourself.
Thank you so much.
And thank you for that question. So that's a really excellent question, Sarita. The reason I created the impresario approach to cognitive networking, and I apologize for the kind of unwieldy and long name, is that I think everybody wants to be a better networker, right? Including me. But what I find is that most people seem to hate networking, even though it's necessary for them for their businesses. And I think there's fundamentally two reasons why people don't like networking. Number one is they don't really know why they're doing it. Right? They don't really have a plan, but they've been told they need to network, so they go out and try to do it. Reason number two is I think people don't really know how to network. If I was playing baseball and I didn't know why I was playing baseball and I didn't know how to play baseball, it's not likely I would enjoy myself very much. So what we tried to do was create some very simple frameworks for people to think about their networking. And that's why the name is kind of unwieldy. So the impresario approach means essentially be your own impresario, right? Like a Shonda Rhimes or a Andrew Lloyd Webber, right? Have a plan. Who do you want to network with? What do you want to accomplish with these people? Where can you find these people? So I think it gives you a little bit more purpose and focus to what you're doing. And the cognitive networking side is just a reminder that you're networking with human beings, right? At least most of the time. And so you have to think about it from your own perspective, right? What do you, since presumably you are also a human being, at least Sarita, in your case, I know that's true. So what do you respond to, right? How do you want to be approached by people? Would you network with yourself? And I think as soon as you slap the label networking on it, people start to behave in all these weird, unnatural ways, right? They become very salesy. They start to pressure you. They don't really listen anymore. And so we're trying to bring the human element back to networking.
Great. No, thank you so much. And I like that you mentioned the idea that many people don't necessarily like networking, but it is essential. And
Yes.
then once we come to the conclusion, okay, I may not necessarily like it, but I have to do it anyway, then the next question is, well, how do I actually network? And I like that you mentioned one of your rules, which we won't go into each rule, but you do have your 10 rules. And for anyone that listens, we will provide information on how to access that, because there may be a little bit more than 10 rules. But one of the rules on looking at it from a human perspective, and correct me if I'm understanding this correctly, putting yourself in the other person's shoes, right? When you're networking.
Yes. That's exactly right. I mean, fundamentally, we follow the principles set by the great American networker Benjamin Franklin, and he coined the expression that we're trying to create a favorable inclination, and from the other person to you, and it's actually what our parents used to call making friends, right? So you want to get to know the other person, And once you create that relationship, right, you want to do things for your friends, and you want to do what's in their own best interest, what's in their best interest, and your friends want to do the same thing for you because you're friends. And that's really the essence of networking. So that's the thing we try to get people to sort of think about it in that framework. And then we also have like protocols and processes up front that when you meet people, how to essentially build that relationship, and essentially how to help create new friendships. Because I think a lot of people, especially in their the adult stages of their life, have sort of forgotten it or don't really know how to do it anymore.
And that's a very good point in terms of trying to really develop this and think of it as a friendship. I love that term, as friends, as opposed to a business transaction, right?
Well, I think because there are other schools of thought when it comes to networking, right? So one of them is like be a giver, right? It's kind of one approach. Another approach you often hear people talk about is reciprocity, and those are the ones we kind of try to address. So in terms of being a giver, right, I don't really like that because it's sort of vague, right? Like give what, to whom, for what purpose, right? And so that's the impresario approach, is to have more of a plan than just to say I'm going to give, to everybody who comes along or something like that. So I think that's a little bit too vague. The reciprocity part is, turns everything into a transaction, and essentially it makes people into pests. Right? Because so if I reach out to you, Sarita, and say, "Hi, Sarita, do you remember that favor I did for you last week? Well, where's the favor that you now owe me?" And so now I'm just going to hound you until I get a favor back. And so what that happens is I've seen somebody on Twitter recently refer to this as emotional debt. Right? You're now in debt to me, and nobody wants to be in debt. And so I think when you think of it that way, people just want to get out of debt, right? So it's like, oh my God, pardon my language, I owe Victor a favor. I'll just do this for him and maybe he'll go away, right? And so it becomes way too transactional, and you're not really getting the value out of it. So that's why we say we want people to be friends, and then you'll want to work in each other's best interest. And in the process of trying to get to know people, rule number 10 out of our 10 rules is called filter your network, right? So as you go through life, you meet lots of people, and some of them are great and some of them are less than great. And some of them become your friends and lots of them don't, which is fine too. So that's really what we're trying to say is, use networking to create friends, and then your friends will help each other.
Okay, so taking all of that, and you've mentioned some of your rules as a part of your rules to becoming an impresario in networking. And can you tell us, you mentioned the Benjamin Franklin effect, but can you tell us how you came up with these specific rules to make us better networkers?
Sure. That's a great question. I basically just looked around and saw either how I was behaving, where it worked or it didn't work, or how other people were interacting. And I'll give you an example. One of the rules, I think it's number 7, is one message at a time, right? So one of the processes we've created is like, especially when you meet somebody in a networking event on a Zoom call, and then you connect on LinkedIn afterwards, right? A lot of times you get a message from somebody that says, "Hi, Sarita, great meeting you. I do this. What do you do? Let's get together. Let's figure out how to help each other," right? And they're trying to cram it all into one message. And it becomes kind of jumbled. Or somebody sends you an email and there's 5 questions in it when you've barely met this person. So one message at a time means let's take our time and build the relationship. So tell me something about you. I see you have a PhD, and what prompted you to do that? And how did you build your business? But those are all sort of individual messages that we sort of space out over time, right? So again, it's like building a relationship. You rarely create a friendship overnight. It takes time. So that's kind of one message. Another rule we got from Benjamin Franklin, which is to make it the other person's idea. So part of what we do is, as you develop the relationship, right? If I right away say, "Hey, Sarita, it was great meeting you. Let's get together and let's meet and have coffee," and so on and so forth, right? Then it's me trying to impose my ideas on you. But if we develop the relationship and the friendship, then it might make sense at some time for you to say, "Hey, Victor, gee, it's great having this conversation. Let's get together. Let's have coffee," right? And that way, it becomes your idea, not my idea, and you're more committed or invested in your own idea, obviously, than in mine. So that's just another way of looking at it.
Right. Absolutely. I love that. And having
Thank
said
you.
that, especially with regard to making it the other person's idea, and as I'm listening to you, what I'm hearing is that when we establish this relationship, that we are listening more than trying to sell or talk. Let kind of get to learn more about the person's interest, and then the person will say, "Hey, let's get together." And so that's a very good point, as well as many of the other points that you've mentioned within your 10 rules. So how does your framework differ from other frameworks with talking about how to become a better networker?
Sure. Well, I think the listening part is very important, right? Because ultimately, you want and I hate to put this in transactional terms, right? Nobody likes to be sold to, but everybody loves to buy. So it's important as the relationship develops, because I mean, it is a business relationship as well as a social relationship, is what is it that you need? What are you looking for? And for you to tell me how I can help you, right? Rather than me telling you how I can help you, because you might say, well, I don't need that help. And so part of the process is the slow build. And I'll give you an example. So for example, like let's say we just met on a networking call, and I send you a note saying, "Hey, let's connect on LinkedIn." As part of the relationship building, and I think we all know that the note should be personalized. The LinkedIn invitation should be personalized, right? And not the standard, but it's like, "Hi, Sarita, we met at this networking event. Let's connect," right? So that's the one message. And then if assuming you accept, LinkedIn sends me a notification that says Sarita has accepted your LinkedIn invitation. So with my program, I then forward that email back to you. And I say, "Hi, Sarita, thank you so much for having accepted my LinkedIn invitation." Right? So we're continuing the conversation. It's again one message at a time, but also essentially I'm saying I'm thanking you for something. Now, what's kind of funny is there is a school of thought I came across that said you should never thank anybody because that puts you in their debt. And I thought, that's crazy. As part of the building relationship is like, you help me, I'll help you. And we're not doing it transactionally. We're doing it because we're friends. So that's also part of the system, is how to build that relationship, especially because we're doing it over LinkedIn or Zoom or email, as opposed to face, which we used to do in real life.
I'm so glad that you mentioned that, the one message at a time, because I'm sure you've seen on LinkedIn, and it may have happened to you, where somebody will send you a LinkedIn request, you accept, and then all of a sudden you get a barrage of sales pitches without really establishing that relationship. And now that within the last few years, things have become even more virtual. Now you can expand to people outside of the United States. And I'm just curious as to how you think these rules, especially what you've laid out with regard to LinkedIn, how these rules apply within the global marketplace when you're reaching out to people that are in other parts of the world.
That's an excellent question, because obviously, we're often on these networking calls, and it'll be, a bunch of people from California, a bunch of people from New Jersey, and then that person from Australia or Thailand or something else. And so my thought would be that, especially in those situations, is to almost slow it down a little bit more, right? Because because of the distance and the psychological distance, if nothing else, I think you want to really build that relationship slowly, because I think it'll make it seem safer for the other person that you're not coming on too strong. But also, to be perfectly blunt, you kind of want to understand what they're about, right? So why is that person, not to be paranoid, why is that person trying to connect with somebody on the other side of the world? Now it's a little bit different because obviously, in your business is really all about global trade. So I think it's more, maybe it's more apparent when people are trying to connect with you from different parts of the world because they need your help. They're trying to access the U.S. market. Whereas in my case, it's a little bit more. It's a little bit more. I try to be a little bit more wary about what people are trying to do. The nice thing about it is because we're using email and Zoom, it's a little bit easier, I think, to communicate because I find that people are more careful with their messaging. I think in the old days when we used to get together with people, especially people from overseas, you would have a longer conversation, which I would say there's often more room for misunderstanding. But I think with emails, you kind of have to get to the point, and so it's a little bit easier to contain the message and really understand what people are getting at.
That's a very interesting point, because as I was listening to you, I was thinking about, you mentioned the face to face, and even for me, traveling around the world, a lot of times that's what people would prefer, right? To get together in person, to really get to know you, to see, is this someone that I can get to know, that I like, that I actually trust before I do business? And it is a process. It is that relationship building. And what we see with now, we have so many digital ways of connecting that now more people are becoming used to that. And I remember even with some of the various networking groups that I was in, as things started opening up again, the question was, well, would you go back to, if you have to meet with someone overseas, getting on a plane, or are you going to stick with through using the digital communication? And sometimes it would be, well, people are going back to going back to face to face, but then in other cases, now you are seeing where people are more comfortable and you can do some business transactions, but you still have to be careful, as you say, with your email messaging and other whatever way that you communicate to mitigate any misunderstanding. And I'm just curious, have you seen any errors though, where people don't necessarily follow these rules? Have you seen any kind of errors that people have made, especially through digital communication, that can have an impact when networking with people from other parts of the world?
That's an excellent question, Sarita. I think because people are more cautious, I've seen less errors in the digital realm than we see in the in-person realm. And I do think there's a benefit that you're referring to, that we're sort of this hybrid, right? Because with Zoom and email and so on, you can kind of get to know people a little bit better before you say, oh, it's worth taking the trip to go out there and see them, right? Whereas I think in the old days, really the only way to get to know people was to go visit them. And that's expensive, time consuming. And I think that, your chances of success were a little bit lower. The other thing I would say, to your point about sort of misunderstandings, is that it's also tricky because, English is sort of the language that everybody uses. And so, and I imagine you found this in your business as well. So a lot of people you encounter are pretty fluent in English, but it's often still not their original language, or they only use it in business contexts. And so there's a lot of potential, I think, for misunderstanding even though you think you're speaking the same language. And the famous playwright George Bernard Shaw, had that famous quote that said, England and the U.S. are two countries divided by a common language. So one of our podcast guests, who's from the UK, but he spent a lot of time in the US, he actually said, in a sort of cheeky way, he said, it would be better off if the US spoke a different language, like German, because then you'd be more careful in trying to communicate. But the fact that we both speak English makes you think that we're actually communicating, even if we're not. And so I have an example. So there are some words that are different in the UK and US, right, that you recognize right away. So, for example, in the United States, we live in apartments. In the UK, they live in flats. Or, your car has a trunk. In the UK, your car would have a boot. So right away, you realize, oh, those words mean different things. But one word that's a little bit more confusing is the word brilliant, because in the US, brilliant usually means really smart, really good, right? Whereas I think in the UK, brilliant means more like it's terrific, it's great, right? So if I were to say to you, "Oh, that movie was brilliant," right? The UK interpretation would be, "Oh, that was a terrific movie. It was fun. It was entertaining." But the US interpretation might be more like, "Oh, it was really well written. The cinematography was great," right? And so that might be more of an expression used by a movie reviewer, whereas in the UK, a fan might say, "Oh, that movie was brilliant," just because they enjoyed it. And that's it's sort of a nuance, but it's one that you might not necessarily notice if you didn't realize that brilliant meant slightly different things in different contexts.
And that is a great example. I don't know if I should say that's a brilliant example.
What do you mean by that? I'm now completely confused. That was very well done. Very well done.
But that is a really good example because, and I agree, because that's one of the things that I tell people, especially in doing business, where they say, well, it's easier to do business with in countries where English is widely spoken.
Right.
But I do share my own experiences where I've traveled, and even though we both were speaking English, there were times where I had to stop and think, okay, I'm not quite sure what that really meant because of the context. I would hear words, but I didn't quite grasp the meaning of it, even though we were both speaking the same language.
There's another situation, a project I was working on, where I could see a little bit more of a cultural clash. And again, everybody was speaking English, but so one party was, shall we say, from a European country that's known for being very precise and meticulous, right? But the country will go unnamed. And the other party was a gentleman from Vancouver, Canada. And so the European he had like a million questions. How does this work? Can I do this myself? What about this? What about that? Right. So he was very, very detail oriented, right? Whereas the Canadian gentleman was great. I mean, he was very low key and he was very amiable and cooperative and so on and so forth, right? And so it's kind of funny watching I wouldn't say it was a clash, but it was a little bit of a mismatch of styles. And I actually went back to my Canadian counterpart afterwards, and I said to him, "Look, you were way more patient than I would have been, right? Any American would have said, 'Hey, get to the point. What do you want? Right? Do we have a deal? Do we not have a deal?' Right?" And so we would have been much more direct. But the Canadian style, and I'm working a couple of Canadian projects, the folks seem to be much more affable and cooperative, and so it's just trying to sort of manage that, because again, they kind of act slightly differently, look slightly differently, and I think it's good to try to kind of keep that in mind and not take things, like you were saying, not just take things at face value.
Right, and as you mentioned, the different styles, because you're absolutely right, and I find myself kind of switching or adapting in the environment. Whereas, here in the United States, it is more of let's get to the point, let's be focused on time. But in other environments, in other countries where I've had to live and work and do business, and when I'm trying to get things done, I have to adapt. So if things take a little bit longer, or it's more going back to the whole networking, it's not let's exchange business cards, we've got a deal or we don't have a deal. It may take a little time to get to know the person, and then sometimes you have to read in between the lines, whether it's in English or in my case where I speak fluent Spanish, even in Spanish-speaking countries, sometimes I just have to stop and think and not take it as you said, face value. Is this really what they meant? Or try to understand the different styles when you're dealing with different communities, people of different backgrounds and from different cultures and different communities.
Right, exactly. And so, not to be totally paranoid about this, but I remember talking to a woman at one point I think she was originally German, right? I forget what the topic was. And I was being slightly indirect, right? And she said to me, "I'm European, just tell me." Just like that, right? And so I want to kind of be a little bit careful on that, because it's what she said, but I didn't know, it wasn't clear whether she was thinking, I didn't want to play into stereotypes of how European folks do business, and whether she liked the stereotype or not. And because people are kind of funny about their own countries. And I had one client who will go unnamed, and he was French, and so as you would notice right away when you met him. And at one point we started talking about how he came to the U.S. and he built his own business. He said, "Yeah, I moved to America because I hate the French." And I was thinking, "Aren't you French?" Right? So it was kind of that. That was kind of a weird. I'm not quite sure I forgot what his answer was. But again, it's kind of funny how people view, themselves, their country of origin, the United States, so on and so forth. So
Right.
It's fun, but you want to be careful, like you said, but not be totally paranoid about it.
Right.
Because fundamentally, I think people are the same, but because there's tremendous variation among people in the U.S. Some
Exactly.
people are more straightforward, some people are less straightforward, and some people are dependable, and some people are less dependable, right? So the variation in the U.S. is probably as great as the variation between the U.S. and folks in other countries. So I don't want to overstate the difference. So one of my clients had done a lot of work. He's based in the U.S., is an American, and done a lot of business setting up factories around the world. Right. So, and it had been in Europe, it had been in Asia. So he was used to dealing with a lot of different cultures, right? And really coming in, and he was very good at what he did. But at the same time, what he recognized was, in order to really network and connect with people, he felt fundamentally, rather than trying to deal with the issues of them speaking English to him, and then dealing with all the questions that you and I had just talked about, he felt it was important. He's now in the translation business, because he felt it was more important for him to network with people overseas, for him to be able to speak to them in their language, provide content in their language, right? Because he also felt that, as he said, when people speak to me in English, they're speaking from their head. When I communicate with them in their language, I'm speaking to their heart.
All right. Well, our last few questions. So is there anything else that you think that is very important to highlight that may not have come out in our discussion so far? Any additional information that we should be aware of regarding your framework?
Sure. Thank you for asking. I think it's really about, I don't mean to become religious about this, but it boils back to the golden rule, right? Treat people how you would like to be treated. So, as you said, we don't want to go through all the 10 rules, but some of them are: people like to be acknowledged. So if people respond to you, if they do something to you, but even if they just send you a note saying, "Hey, I saw this article about you, Sarita, or I saw this article I thought you'd be interested in," right? Then I know, like, you're very good at responding, saying, "Gee, thanks for the article," right? Acknowledging what somebody else has done. And what I think is great, Sarita, is this kind of goes back to what I think you said earlier, right? A lot of this is very simple, right? And some of it is actually simple and easy. So it doesn't really take much to acknowledge people, to thank people. And I think it goes a long way towards building that relationship, because you're doing it a little bit at a time.
So if there are two takeaways that you would like to highlight, two things that people should take away from today's discussion.
Sure. The two things I think are really the two ends of the networking method, right? The impresario approach, which is to have a plan, be very deliberate in your networking. Don't just show up at some event and, I don't know, who knows what's going to happen, right? But think about what you're doing, why you're going to certain events, like you've talked about when you built your business, right? There were certain events you went to because you knew they'd be good for you, and there were others you avoided. So have a plan in mind. And secondly, just be nice to people. Again, it's actually free to be nice. It's easy, at least for most people, and it's simple. So I think fundamentally, if you're trying to make friends, which is what this is about, is to be authentic, be yourself. And I think that's what people respond to. Right? The one caveat I would have is, if somebody is a terrible person and they're authentically their own terrible self, I can't help them, right? That's just who they are. But then I think people like you and I want to hang out with people that we like, and fortunately, and people who like us. And fortunately, there's plenty of those, at least so far.
Right. Absolutely. And so tell us, how can we find out about all of the rules if we want to learn more about each of the rules to become an impresario and networking? And then also, how can we find your podcast?
Well, people can reach me on LinkedIn. So it's Victor, middle initial L, like Lee, right? Victor L. Lee, because there's lots of Victor Lees, unfortunately, on LinkedIn. You can find the podcast on all your podcast platforms like Spotify and the others. The title is, as you mentioned earlier, thank you, Sarita, is Things I Didn't Learn at Harvard. I also spend a lot of time on Twitter. So I think Twitter is a great place to learn things and see what's going on. And Sarita, I know you're on Twitter a lot. And again, I'm Victor L. Lee on Twitter, and you'll know it's me because I'm sitting there with my dog, my late dog. And I'm happy to connect with anybody and everybody, and let's see what we can make happen out there.
So again, this was Victor Lee, the co-host of the networking podcast, Things I Didn't Learn at Harvard, and the creator of the Impresario Approach to Cognitive Networking and president of Stonehorse Enterprises.
Exactly. Thanks, Sarita. That was brilliant.